In the last couple of years, vast areas of the world have experienced massive fertility decline. Since approximately 2020, several countries all around the globe have seen their birth rates absolutely collapse in a rather spectacular manner. This phenomenon lacks a satisfying empirical explanation so far, even though I have my theory that I will present in this video. One cannot miss the fact that the COVID pandemic was the diverging point in this regard, which led many people to conclude that the vaccination against COVID may be blamed for this massive decrease. However, this explanation also isn't satisfactory, since there is no correlation between the vaccination rate and the fertility decline whatsoever. Some of the most thoroughly vaccinated countries on the planet, for example Portugal or Ireland, have not seen significant drops in their fertility. In many countries, the decline began in 2020, before the vaccines were even developed and distributed. But the COVID pandemic and the social response to it have clearly started something off. As was already said, this crashing fertility decline is truly a global phenomenon. Some of the worst affected countries are places as diverse as Chile or Thailand. Both will likely see their total fertility rate go under 1 child per woman in 2024, which was previously observable only in the East Asian region. It would be out of the scope of a single video to truly apprehend the cultural and economic reality of such a diverse bunch of countries. If there is someone from Chile watching this video, let me know in the comments what the hell is going on there. I will thus talk about the one region where the decline is also absolutely crushing, and which I also know very well, since I live here, which is post-communist Europe. I want to specifically talk about the countries that experienced massive declines not only in the absolute number of births, but also in their fertility rate. The reason for this is simple. Total fertility rate is a measurement that controls the number of women of childbearing age. It only considers women aged 15 to 49. So the women conventionally seen as being of reproductive age. That is why it is the most commonly used measurement of the demographic conditions of different societies. Another broadly used demographic statistic, the crude birth rate, which simply measures the number of births per 1,000 people, is somewhat problematic, because it is very much influenced by the age structure of the population. I will demonstrate this with a simple example. In 2021, my home country, the Czech Republic, had a total fertility rate of 1.83 children per woman, the highest in Europe that year. Quite surprisingly for most people, the fertility rate of the Czech Republic in that year was higher than that of Brazil, Iran or Turkey. Countries that most people uninterested in the subject presume have very high fertility rates. But even though the Czech Republic had a higher fertility rate, the crude birth rate, so the number of births per 1,000 people, was higher in all three mentioned countries. The reason is simple. The Czech Republic has about 10 years higher average age than Turkey, Iran or Brazil. There are just more women of childbearing age in those countries. That is why, despite the lower fertility rate, they produce more children per 1,000 people. So, back to Eastern Europe. In the 2020s, the decline in the absolute number of births was inevitable, because the whole region experienced a demographic collapse in the 1990s and early 2000s, caused by the disintegration of the Eastern Bloc communist regimes. The number of births often declined by 40 to 50% between the late 1980s and late 1990s, while the fertility rate plummeted from around 2 children per woman to around 1. That is why most post-communist countries have a recognizable population pyramid, characterized by the massive and abrupt decline of the 1990s and a slight rebound in the 2010s. The tiny cohorts born in the 1990s are now in the primary childbearing age, so the significant decline in the absolute number of births was inevitable. If the number of women of childbearing age gets reduced by, let's say, 40%, only a remarkable increase in fertility rate could possibly compensate for that. When the number of women of childbearing age is declining due to previous demographic development, the number of live births can decline proportionally. At the same time, the total fertility rate remains more or less unchanged. However, if the total fertility rate declines, there is a real change in the reproductive patterns of the population. One of the specifics of the regional demographics in post-communist Europe is quite a significant level of volatility. It is a question if that is caused by the fact that the events in Eastern Europe are very volatile, or if the populations of Eastern European countries are somewhat more responsive to the volatility of events, likely a bit of both. When you look at the fertility patterns in some of the traditionally low fertility countries worldwide, for example Germany, Italy or Japan, there is a quite remarkable level of stability. During the 50 years between 1973 and 2023, German fertility never left the 1.2 to 1.6 children per woman range. In the 40 years between 1984 and 2024, Italian fertility oscillated between 1.2 and 1.5 children per woman. And the Japanese fertility has also been very steady, bouncing between 1.2 and 1.5 for 30 years. When you look at the population pyramid of Japan or Italy, you can see that after these countries completed the demographic transition and went sub-replacement, there were no additional abrupt changes. The number of births just gradually slowly declines. These countries have just found their reproductive status quo and remain within it. This status quo is not good. The fertility is very low, but it is stable. When you look at Eastern Europe, you can see very different pictures. Whether we look at Russia, Romania, Czech Republic, Estonia or Lithuania, the fertility rate behaves like a sinusoid to an extent. It went from levels around 2 children per woman in the late socialist period to ultra-low levels close to 1 child per woman in the late 1990s and early 2000s, to briefly bounce back to levels around 1.8 children per woman in the stable period of the 2010s, only to crash again to levels close to 1 child per woman in the current years. An exception from this rule seems to be Poland, which never saw its fertility rate go over 1.5 once it fell under this threshold. There are some interesting takeaways from this observation. The positive takeaway is that the populations of Eastern Europe are mostly capable of exhibiting relatively high fertility in modern circumstances, if the conditions are right. It is very hard to imagine what would have to be done for Germans to have 1.8 children per woman, since, in the past 50 years, there undeniably were periods of prosperity and stability in Germany. The bad news is that the stable and prosperous years of 2010s are gone and will not return. The region has been hit by what can be called a perfect socio-demographic storm in the past couple of years, the combination of the war in Ukraine and a massive inflation wave. Before I get into the cultural aspects of fertility, I want to talk about one of the socio-economic factors, specifically the importance of stability for fertility. No one can argue that the late socialist regimes in Eastern Europe were prosperous, but they possessed certain perverted stability. The system was, to a certain extent, predictable. People mostly knew where they would live and in what factory they would work, presumably for the rest of their lives. They also knew that they would never get rich, which ironically also provided certain stability. Social mobility is a wonderful thing. I am not here advocating for socialism, but it is also good to note that psychologically, social mobility is kind of taxing. You need to constantly worry not only about getting poor and losing your status, but you are also constantly tempted by the possibility of getting even richer. Statistics from many Western countries show that fertility by income group slowly starts to get U-shaped. The poorest and the richest have more children, while the middle has the lowest fertility. There is also the factor of broader long-term institutional stability. When you look at the developed countries with relatively higher fertility in the post-1960s world, they are connected by what can be called long-term continuity of state development. United Kingdom, United States, Australia, New Zealand, France, Scandinavia, the Netherlands and such have all been developing relatively organically for centuries, gradually accommodating to industrialization, democratization, liberalism, and urbanization, without massive social upheavals caused by revolutions, regime changes, brutal foreign occupations, homegrown totalitarianism, or even complete abruption of the existence of the state as such. That is not to say their histories were uneventful. Still, even a country like France, which experienced revolutions, regime changes, foreign occupation and such, has a much more deep-rooted perception of stability than countries in Eastern Europe, which mainly did not exist 120 years ago. They experienced a level of historical uncertainty that is hard to comprehend from the point of view of an American or an Englishman. If you were born near Uzhgorod in 1917 and lived there your whole life, you managed to live in 5 countries during your lifetime, without even traveling out of your village. Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, the Hungarian state during the Second World War, the Soviet Union, and then an independent Ukraine. Children can be seen as an investment of sorts, an investment into one's future. What every investor values is stability and predictability. The problem is that that Eastern Europe is an inherently unstable region. That brings us to the massive inflation wave and the war in close proximity, which both very negatively influence the fertility rate in Eastern Europe. Inflation is a nightmare for some sort of family planning, since it instills tremendous uncertainty about the future. It is tough to make calculations, including family budgeting, if prices constantly increase, especially prices of essential goods like utilities, food or rent. Inflation was significantly higher in post-communist Europe than in the western part of the continent. And together with that came the war. The war sent shockwaves through the collective psyche of the region's nations. The old specter of war once again haunts Eastern Europe. Conscription is being reinstated in some countries and contemplated in others. Countries are planning to ramp up the size of their militaries. But in the back of one's mind must inevitably lurk the question, is it even conceivable in the reality of steep demographic decline? The future, which might have looked reasonably stable and predictable just a couple of years before, now appears to be hidden behind a dark cloud of uncertainty. So far, I have spoken mostly about socio-economic reasons for the current fertility decline. However, the issue of low fertility is also a cultural issue. In terms of culture, the division seems relatively clear. The countries that have been organically developing for centuries into what can be called liberal capitalist democracies have fared significantly better than the countries that have undergone rapid modernization in the second half of the 20th century. The more culturally traditional societies, suddenly thrown into the whirlwind of economic and cultural modernity, usually get completely demographically wrecked by it. To a certain extent, it is similar to the long-term continuity and stability of statehood and its constitutional and legal order that I mentioned in the previous chapter. The countries that have been liberal, industrial, capitalist, urbanized and secular for the longest period just seem better adapted to the pitfalls of modernity. Once again, this mostly includes Northwestern Europe and the Anglosphere. In opposition to that, Germanic Central Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe and East Asia struggle significantly more, and the development in the rest of the world will likely be similar. Countries in Latin America, Southeast Asia and even the Muslim world have seen their birth rates plummet in the past couple of years. Now, you might argue that all of the countries have sub-replacement fertility anyway, so why does it matter so much if it is 1.3 or 1.8 children per woman? Well, it matters a great deal. At a total fertility rate above 1.6 children per woman, population decline is gradual. A country with a fertility rate of 1.8 will be 80% as large after a century of decline, whereas one with a total fertility rate of 1.3 might collapse to a mere quarter of its size by the end of the 21st century. So, while it might seem that spending a lot of time researching and describing why one country can stay in the 1.6 to 2 children per woman territory, while other is at 1.3 is pointless, it really is not. It might very well make the difference between a country surviving and a country disintegrating. However, the decline of the past couple of years is common for almost all countries and regions. The fertility rate in the UK, Sweden, Canada and Norway is around 1.4, and the United States is at 1.6. The lowest in their history. Even the etalons of relatively higher fertility are getting crushed. So, there are forces in play that cannot be easily explained by regional factors. There are global factors in play. When it comes to the traditional American division of generations, the boomers, Generation X, and the millennials, I was always a bit skeptical when applying these categories to countries from different cultural contexts. There are no boomers in the term's original meaning in post-communist Europe, since the term specifically describes the massive post-war generations living in the Western countries in the decades of unprecedented prosperity and cultural change. Without this cultural context, the term sort of loses its meaning. A person born in communist Romania, Belarus or Latvia in the 1950s is technically of the same generation as someone born in the US, UK or Germany in the same year, but has almost nothing in common with his Western peers regarding the cultural context. But it is fair to acknowledge that there is a level of homogenization as we move through time. The internet era is especially potent in this regard, since in a world connected by the internet, young people worldwide, at least in parts of the world where internet connection, computers and smartphones are common, are exposed to similar cultural and psychological challenges. So, while speaking about some kind of world baby boomer generation is mostly nonsensical, outside of the Western world, speaking about global Generation Z is more acceptable, even though there still is a massive diversity. I think that the common denominator of the current fertility decline is precisely that. While young people do not consume the same kind of content content online all around the world, they are all consuming content online and spending time on their devices all around the world. Now, these kind of issues will certainly be researched more profoundly in the future, but I made just a basic comparison of the countries where kids spend most time on their screens with the fertility development of these countries. The top 10 countries were South Africa, Brazil, Philippines, Argentina, Colombia, Chile, Mexico, Thailand, Russia, and Malaysia. With the notable exception of South Africa, every one of these countries experienced significant fertility decline in the past couple of years, just as the generations growing up in the online era entered the reproductive age, and every one of them is now sub-replacement. Correlation does not have to mean causation, but I think it is the most likely answer. The excessive usage of electronic devices, social media, and overall internet presence is connected with increased mental health issues, such as anxiety and a decline in real-world human interactions. I think we are now witnessing what is a rather spectacular collision of human reproductive behavior with the havoc wreaked on the human psyche by the rise of the online world. Moreover, the internet also opens up Pandora's box of ideological indoctrination by toxic versions of modern Western feminism that are blatantly antinatalist. So, with all the aforementioned factors considered, we can now analyze what is taking place in the region, demographic-wise. Basically, the worst possible scenario is taking place. In most of the region's countries, the very small 1990s cohorts of people are now exhibiting remarkably low fertility, close to 1 child per woman. In many countries, this is combined with persistent and large-scale emigration. In the center of the region lies the demographic black hole of Ukraine, a country ravaged by decades of low birth rates, high death rates, very high emigration, and finally, a destructive war with the invading Russia. I made a video specifically about Ukraine not that long ago. Still, to summarize, it is not overtly dramatic to claim that Ukrainian demographics are likely beyond the point of no return. The contemporary wave of emigration was overwhelmingly composed of children and women, and it is estimated that about half of all Ukrainian children under 10 now live abroad. As the country gets increasingly demolished by the military conflict, the probability of them returning declines, and the probability of another wave of emigration increases. There are also hundreds of thousands of war casualties. Ukraine had 52 million people in 1992, while it is estimated that the population of the territory currently controlled by the Ukrainian government might be around 28 million people, disproportionately composed of pensioners, combat-disabled soldiers, and injured, sick, and traumatized individuals. Right next to Ukraine is Belarus, a country that has been kind of out of the spotlight since the war broke out, but which nevertheless also experiences a shattering decline in fertility rate and the number of births. Belarusian fertility declined from a relatively reasonable post-communist peak of 1.7 children per woman in 2014 to 2016 to 1.3 in 2021. Since then, the Belarusian government has not released fertility rate statistics, but the number of births has declined from 80,000 in 2021 to 65,000 in 2023. Given the severity of the decline, the fertility rate is now likely around 1 child per woman. A significant emigration wave has hit Belarus, caused both by the political repression of the regime that is routinely trying to get its opponents, mostly recruited from the urban educated classes, out of the country, and due to the weakness of the Belarusian economy, based on state-run enterprises. Belarusians are thus incentivized to emigrate both to the West and to Russia. Russia itself is faring only marginally better. Purely by natural population decline, almost 17 million more Russians have died than have been born since 1992. This decline has been mitigated by immigration of more than 7 million ethnic Russians from ex-USSR into the Russian Federation, as well as other migratory streams. Like Belarus, Russia experienced a temporary spike in its birth rates in the 2010 to 2016 period, which can be seen as a period of stability induced by the high oil prices and the overall success of Putin's regime in curbing the chaos of the post-communist period. The number of births and the fertility rate went from a low point of 1.2 million and 1.15 children per woman respectively in 1999 to a peak of almost 2 million births and a fertility rate of around 1.7 children per woman in 2014 and 2015. As is common with many many countries in the region, part of this demographic spike was due to the large 1980s generations still being in the reproductive age. Throughout Eastern Europe, many people have postponed childbearing in the 1990s and 2000s due to the overall social upheaval of the transitory period. Then, this accumulated postponement resulted in a temporary spike in fertility as soon as the situation stabilized. That has happened in Russia, Belarus, Romania, the Czech Republic, Poland, or the Baltic countries. However, the overall number of births has declined since then, reaching 1,260,000 in 2023, while the fertility rate is now around 1.4 children per woman. Moreover, the fertility rate of the Russian regions that actually lie in Eastern Europe, so the central, northwestern, southern, and Volga federal districts, was closer to 1.3 children per woman in 2022. Emigration-induced brain drain, as well as war casualties, also negatively impact Russian future demographic prospects. Now, Russia's population has actually increased quite a bit in the past years, from less than 143 million in 2008 to over 146 million. Still, the vast majority of this increase has been through the annexation of Crimea and parts of Donbass, and also the refugee wave from Ukraine fleeing to Russia in 2022, which was very large. 1.3 million Ukrainian refugees are estimated to stay in Russia. Now, there is also a migration from Central Asian countries, which is specific in its nature. But apart from that, those population increases are cosmetic changes in the long run. Whether through conquest or immigration, devouring populations with the same reproductive characteristics as your own, the same ultra-low fertility, and the same damaged age structure cannot change the overall course of events. It is robbing Peter to pay Paul, as the English say. The same goes for countries in the West, such as Poland and the Baltic countries. It can postpone the final judgment, but it won't avert it. If the trends from January and February of 2024 were extrapolated for the rest of the year, Russia would lose 780,000 people by natural decline. But due to its sheer size, Russia still remains in a far better demographic position than most of the region's countries. The Polish fertility rate went from 1.45 in 2017, when 400,000 children were born in Poland, to 1.1 in 2023, when a mere 273,000 children were born. Data for 2024 suggests that the decline is continuing. For some context, in 1983, 720,000 Poles were born. That is a decline of 62% in 40 years. Will this decline continue? Will Poland see its fertility go under 1 child per woman? Same as with Russia, the very low Polish fertility was up to now sort of mitigated by the fact that the very large 1980s generations were still in the reproductive age. But that is gone now, as the 1990s cohorts combined fertility close to 1 child per woman with the fact that they are very small. The number of births will just go further and further down in the foreseeable future. The Baltic countries are in an even worse position, since they already have very small populations. The fertility rate stood at 1.14 in Lithuania, around 1.3 in Estonia, and around 1.4 in Latvia. The three republics together recorded less than 45,000 births in 2023. In the late 1980s, 127,000 births were recorded in the three republics. Sure, more Russians lived in the republics back then, many of whom have left since. But still, that is just 35% of the 1980s births. That is just brutal. As usual, the data for 2023 shows the freefall in births continuing. Where is the threshold under which a country like Latvia, the poorest of the three, just ceases to function as a modern country? Latvia already resembles a city-state of sorts, with the Riga metropolitan area being the only place in the country with some dynamism and momentum, accommodating half of Latvia's population and half of its GDP. The rest of the country is increasingly a depopulated poor hinterland. That is a theme that is repeating itself in the whole region. Only the largest cities are recording population growth. Even though many Eastern European countries have a sizable rural population, significantly larger than is the standard in Western Europe. These populations either do not have significantly higher fertility than the urban dwellers, or the fertility advantage is just in no way sufficient to compensate for the overall demographic decline caused by high mortality and mass emigration. When you look at Poland, almost 40% of the population lives in the countryside, and around 8% of Poland's workforce works in agriculture, which is a lot. However, it does not have any demographic benefits. The rural fertility in Poland has been only marginally higher than that of urban areas for decades, and has likely completely converged by now. Young people do not want to live and work there. The age profile of agricultural workers is significantly older than the national average. Romania, Russia, Ukraine or Moldova do have rural fertility advantage, but it is just nowhere near enough. The rural regions are depopulating the fastest. Most of the Eastern European countryside is not a particularly prosperous place to live, unless one has an acquired taste. All the economic development in Eastern Europe concentrate in the cities, which continue to suck up the youth from the rest of the countries. Warsaw, Prague and Budapest are projected to be economically fastest growing metropolitan areas in Europe by Oxford Economics. That looks like good development at first sight, but it also reinforces the vicious cycle of unequal regional development, resulting in even worse demographic prospects. The Moscow metropolitan area's population grew by 15% between 2010 and 2021 and now has 21 million people. The Czech Republic recorded a decline in births of a whopping 20% in just 2 years between 2021 and 2023. The fertility rate dropped from 1.83 to 1.45. The preliminary data from maternity hospitals points to this decline continuing in 2024. Our fertility rate will likely go under 1.4 this year. The number of live births in Romania declined by almost 30% between 2018 and 2023. I could go on and analyze the data in several additional countries, but you get the general gist. There are a couple of countries in the Balkans that seems to dodge the current fertility decline, like Serbia or Bulgaria, but it unfortunately does not seem to matter that much in the long run. Those countries are beyond the point of no return as well. Even with a solid fertility of 1.8 children per woman, Bulgaria is seeing a natural population decline of over 40,000 people annually. The number of women of childbearing age is just too low. Now, what to make of it all? To be honest with you, I am moving to a very black-pilled positions in this regard. I might even be moving to positions of certain accelerationism. The crash is unavoidable at this moment. It will come. Nothing can avert it at this point. None of the governments can devise meaningful policies that would increase fertility. And one cannot really blame them. It is likely impossible in the contemporary framework. One can look at Hungary, which really tried, but failed. The effect of its policies is negligible in comparison with their costs. Paying people to have children does not work. One can look at the United Arab Emirates, a country where the people have an unimaginable amount of basically free government money, but the fertility still is sub-replacement. There is only one country on the planet that can produce rich, highly educated, secular urban people, where both in the couple work and still can be on the replacement level, and that is Israel. However, the reason for this cannot be duplicated by government policies, however well thought out. It lies within the people. Israelis know that if they want to survive as a society, as an ethnic group, they need to reproduce. Otherwise, all that their fathers and grandfathers fought for would be lost. The Israeli state, whatever one might think of its policies, is filled with something that other modern states lack: mythological substance and a sense of purpose. I talk to people about this all the time, young people of my generation. The probability of a significant increase in fertility among the current generation is close to zero. My country experiences a complete fertility crash, and apart from a few articles and some comments about the unsustainability of the pension systems, no one really cares. The issues stemming from the demographic decline are completely abstract for most people. Even if they are all experiencing them, they cannot connect the dots. Fertility has also been completely politicized, both in terms of female rights and in terms of environmentalism. When one debates these issues with people, you can hear the answers sooner than they even arrive. You just want to make baby-making machines from women and restrict their reproductive rights. It is entirely up to a choice of every person if he or she wants to have children. Or, I definitely do not want to increase my carbon footprint by having children. Alright then. I don't argue with people anymore, since it is useless. I can present a detailed and logically flawless presentation on why the demographic crash is a catastrophe, but people are not interested in thinking about it in logical terms. They are emotionally invested in their truths. But let me tell you, in the reality of societies falling apart due to population collapse, no one will give a damn about female rights. And if all the persuaded feminists just won't reproduce and pass on their values, well, there won't be many feminists in the future. The crash will come. It needs to come. I now start looking beyond the horizon. Which regions will be the first to find a way out? Here, Eastern Europe is one of the contestants. Generally, two regions on the planet are in the most developed phases of the demographic crisis: Eastern Europe and East Asia. Mediterranean and the Germanic Central Europe are not far behind, but have different socio-economic situations, mainly due to the different immigration dynamics. Eastern Europe and East Asia combine several traits. They are aging massively and will undergo massive depopulation throughout this century. They are also not natural beneficiaries of large immigration flows. Both East Asian and Eastern European countries are quite ethnocentric and dismissive of large-scale ethnic change in their countries. In the case of Eastern Europe, there is also the issue of desirability. No immigrants want to settle in the depopulating and decaying countryside of Ukraine, Moldova or Belarus. Vast majority of immigration streams are between the countries in the region, such as Ukrainians immigrating to Russia, Poland or the Czech Republic. Both regions have also been ravaged by modernity, both communism and global capitalism, which demolished the traditional rural social patterns without any functioning replacement. Even the countries that have been quite successful in the arena of global capitalism, like South Korea or Poland, are paying the ultimate demographic price. Both regions possess certain deep-rooted conservatism and traditionalism, which is nevertheless quite powerless in confrontation with the pitfalls of modernity. Female emancipation in the form of academic and labor participation of women is especially detrimental to the fertility of these societies, since they are growing from very different anthropological roots than the historically much more egalitarian Western countries. In Eastern Europe and East Asia, it is significantly culturally harder to somehow combine the traditional motherhood role of women with their sudden burst onto the labor markets. It does not make much of a difference if a nominally conservative government is in power, like in Russia or Hungary, or if some more liberal forces come into power. Ideologically, Eastern Europe seems to either be oscillating between taking over bits of Western progressive ideology or clinging onto the remnants of the 19th century ethnic nationalism, which nevertheless seems to have lost its power. While many countries are nominally still rather religious practices are collapsing among the young generations. Neither religion nor nationalism is enough to persuade young people to procreate sufficiently or not to leave for wealthier countries. There is something symbolic about the fact that the depopulation seems to be gathering pace somewhere in the ancient homeland of the early Slavs. The current order is not working for Eastern European people, whether Slavic, Baltic, Romanian or Hungarian. They are fading away faster than any other population on the planet. Ideologically and spiritually, a window seems to be opening for the emergence of something new. Not all of the nations of the region will survive it, only the larger, stronger or more adaptive ones. Those which do will definitely be changed. Those among us who manage to have children, the more the better, and also manage to raise them in a way that encourages them to also reproduce in the face of the omnipresent antinatalist pressures, will have a disproportionate genetic impact on the future of the region.